my interests in religious experience and transformative experience kind of overlap with one another. I'm a theologian, and so I come at the question primarily from the discipline of theology. And like Mike, I'm interested in the theology of religious experience particularly. I'm a Christian theologian, so in the Christian tradition, religious experiences are primarily thematized as transformative experiences. Mm-hmm. It isn't actually until more recently, that is to say a few hundred years, that the kinds of questions that philosophers of religion now are interested in were the main topics in talking about religious experiences. So the questions about the epistemology of religious experience focus on issues of skepticism, on what it is that such experiences can actually deliver to us in terms of our beliefs about the existence of God and this kind of thing. Whereas there was no real debate about the existence of God, prior to 1500 or something like that, right? Mm-hmm. So in the Christian tradition, most of the reflection on our experiences of God actually are reflections on what counts as an edifying experience of God. What kinds of experiences of God are transformative? How are they transformative? What kind should we seek? Not are there any, right? And so much like what Mike described, I'm interested in some of the theological constraints on how to think about our experiences of God and what they tell us and how they change us. And so the Christian mystical tradition, beginning roughly in the 3rd and 4th centuries and heading all the way through into the present, is a tradition I've been interested in sort of reconstructing. So how do we take the concerns of theology in shaping the way we think about God's immanence and transcendence, human faculties to perceive God, and questions about nature and grace, the extent to which our ability to perceive God depends not just on our constitution, but on God's special acts that assist us in perceiving God. How should we think about those topics now, and what sort of ways of talking about that from the past can be recovered and which can't, and why? So that's kind of...
Can I ask about, we were chatting about this a little bit before, about how the mystical, especially how these Christian mystical traditions go about teaching us to experience our own minds. Because I take it that experience our own minds in relation to God is a really important thing to be able to do, mm-hmm. especially to appreciate the divine, one might say.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to hear more about...
Yeah, so like you might expect, different theologians, mystical, what we might call mystical theologians, that's kind of, there's a lot of controversy about who are mystics, who aren't mystics. So, mm-hmm. For now we can just drop it and talk about theologians who are interested in questions about religious experience. Mm-hmm. And as you might expect, they differ with one another a lot. Mm-hmm. So to kind of highlight the way in which that happens, we could think about the difference between Gregory of Nyssa, a 4th century Cappadocian Greek church father, and Augustine, mm-hmm. In the Latin Western tradition. And Augustine is famously thinks of us as opaque to ourselves. We don't know ourselves, and our access to our and our introspective access to what we're like and where we stand before God, and even on our self-understanding, our moral self-understanding, is very limited, mm-hmm. and we're usually wrong about ourselves. Mm-hmm. And so we actually, in fact, his way of thinking about our need for revelation, our need for the church, and so on, is actually in part motivated by an inaccessibility we have to ourselves, right? But Gregory of Nyssa, on the other hand,
but we can ask. So that's like it's a kind of discovery, right? Because it's not accessible to us, so we need help in making these discoveries.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Right. Mm-hmm. Gregory of Nyssa, on the other hand, really leverages the way in which God's being, what he calls mind and word, corresponds to us being constituted as capable of mental and verbal acts. And so what it is for humans to be made in the image of God for Gregory is actually consists in a certain kind of correspondence that we continue to rely on in our ability to seek God and understand God. So for Gregory, our ability to what the church and the various other Christian practices and liturgies help us to be able to do in understanding ourselves is actually predicated on an ability we already have, which is to understand our own minds.
So it sounds like part of the distinction is with Gregory, there's a process of self-reflection that we have the ability to do, and we need we are supported in this process of self-reflection. Whereas for Augustine, it's about another person is helping us to discover. Is that?
Particularly for Augustine, it's God who helps us, and it mediated through various means or so on. So one way of reading the Confessions, for example, is Augustine telling us about how badly wrong he got everything when he tried to figure it out apart from divine help, right? And so he's regularly confessing ways in which he didn't properly understand himself, he didn't properly understand his own desires, he didn't properly understand what is to be desired, or any of that, and that his introspection was utterly sort of wrong-headed until he was drawn sort of by God, who he says is nearer to us than we are to ourselves.
That's very interesting.
What's the phenomenology of the divine helping there? Right? I mean, this is so this isn't an unusual kind of reporting, right? Where someone takes basically something that's going on in their own mind, it seems, and they attribute it to God. From what you're describing, it sounds like Augustine first undergoes a kind of introspective process, a bit of self-analysis, and recognizes that he's botched it. But then later undergoes, I guess, a very similar process and recognizes, first of all, I didn't botch it this time, and second of all, the process included divine aid. And is there a difference in phenomenology in those two cases?
It's interestingly connected, I think, to what we were just talking about earlier with respect to background beliefs as sort of conditions for recognition. And I think that once he starts externalizing the conditions for recognizing things about himself to being not dependent on his own analysis of himself, but rather dependent on his beliefs about God and God's relation, proper beliefs about God's relation to the world and so on, that he no longer thinks of as dependent on his sort of own, that they're not self-generated. Then it's at that point that he starts to recognize God in his own introspections.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. You said that the tradition has typically thematized, I think is the word you used, thematized religious experiences as transformative experiences.
Yeah.
Do you mean transformative experiences in Laurie's sense? I ask because I mean, one of the things I've been interested in lately is the relationship between religious experiences and transformative experiences, specifically in her sense. And it seems to me that William James characterizes religious experiences along those same lines. I don't have the view that the Christian tradition doesn't. I sort of want to hear more about that.
Can I throw something out?
Yeah.
Because sometimes it really just means kind of personal transformation.
Right.
And the epistemic dimension is really important to
I think that that one of the reasons that I was drawn to Laurie's work on this topic is because of how much it resorts with both in the personal and the epistemic sense. The way in which the Christian tradition talks about sort of not just conversion, but the entire process of one's sort of Christian life is a process of continual transformation, of discovery, rediscovery, that in which one is one's transformation gives one access to God, epistemic access that is not available otherwise. But the epistemic access that's given, what's not clear to me, what I sort of puzzle over, is the way in which the project of theology is taken to be dependent upon transformative experiences of this kind. So I sometimes distinguish between being a mystic, a Christian mystic, and being a mystical theologian. Mm-hmm. And the difference between the two is that, you might say it's possible to have transformative experiences of God, and that they function in an important way in one's spiritual life and so on. But then say that when it comes to doing theology, when we want to know about God, that they don't play necessarily that big a role, right? That just doing some standard theological metaphysics that anybody can do who can take up the relevant conceptual tools and so on, anybody can do that.
There's no specifically first personal dimension, which is really important with the stuff about transformative experiences that I've been
and the mystical theologian denies that that's possible. Says that in order to properly do what theology is about, really is about sort of in some way informationally depending on what's given in a transformative experience of God. So
can I just add, so that there's an important, it's your personal connection to God that's playing a really important role in what you discover and what you know, and in your belief in the revelation, which would make it get close to as opposed to a kind of, stand back, third personal or impersonal perspective, which is kind of the traditional decision theoretic perspective as well. And so you can see some of the work that I'm arguing for is saying, look, there's a whole first personal dimension that we've got to accommodate that's really central and has to be part of the story. And so I can see that fitting with what you were.
Yeah, and so I mean the question, some of the questions that I'm interested in asking are questions about exactly what kind of information is given in the phenomenology of one's experiences of God that is somehow required to do theology. Why did folks think that was the case, right? And whatever information is given by way of that phenomenology, how does it actually shape the theological task? What we're supposed to do and not do, the kind of directions that theological inquiry takes or doesn't take, and what epistemic significance might that have? Not simply sort of accidental significance because of what happens to be the spirituality of the participants, but actually what constitutive role is played by those kinds of experiences.
I'm curious what kind of spirituality is taken to be important to the task. So two things to elaborate on the question. First of all, Sarah Coakley, she has argued, and sometimes she just asserts, right? But it's, her view clearly is theology needs to be done in contemplative practice, right? So you need, if you're going to be doing theology properly, you need to be living this kind of contemplative lifestyle where she doesn't mean just Aristotelian you're just thinking about God. It's the whole ascetic practices and contemplative prayer and all this sort of of that is crucial to the theological enterprise. So there's that. But then also in the tradition, you note this in your work for this conference. In the tradition, you find mystics with very different attitudes toward the sorts of religious experiences that mystics are said to have. For Teresa of Avila, these are cool.
Right.
Don't necessarily seek them for their own sake, but they're cool. For John of the Cross, it's like they're an annoying distraction. Okay, if you find yourself having these, all right, try to get past it. So if I'm sitting down to do theology, I want to follow Sarah Coakley's advice. I want to follow the mystical theologian's advice. But now, look, am I going to follow Teresa? Or am I going to follow John of the Cross? Or does it matter?
Yeah, it absolutely matters. I mean, it's a good example of the way in which a reorientation in thinking about theology is ordered towards transformation can get us asking different kinds of theological questions. Because there's a sense in which, I mean, what you referred to in my paper is that I identify a way of thinking about mystical theology as defined by an ordering to a union with God, right? So, what is theology for? It's for accomplishing and explaining our union with God, both, right? And so then the question is, well, what is union with God? What kind of experiences are indicative of union with God? And then there's debate, right?
Yeah, okay.
And so when you think about the mystic who conceives of union with God as utterly self-annihilating, self-abnegating in a way kind of that parallels what some Buddhists think about, like Mahayana Buddhists or whatever, think about in terms of the annihilation of consciousness. And well, if you're a Christian theologian who holds that constitutes union with God and that's what we ought to be seeking, and then the theological work and the kinds of theological explanation you're going to be given to is going to be different than if you're someone who thinks that is a mistaken picture of what union with God is. But that kind of theological debate is importantly a debate about practices, about what kinds of practices are appropriate for the task of theology, not just what kinds of concepts we ought to entertain and not.
Is the mystical tradition, the mystical theological tradition, is it somewhat pluralist about all of this? So so John of the Cross is a saint, Teresa of Avila is a saint. So in some sense, the church that canonized them approves, right?
Yeah.
And you might think, I also think not nearly every theologian becomes a contemplative mystic, right? So maybe one thought is there are different ways of working this out.
Yeah.
And
well, I think a good analogy here is atonement theory. So there are a lot of different theories of the atonement. So Christians, think that Christ's death on the cross accomplishes our salvation somehow, right? And the way it does it is through the mitigation of our sin somehow again, right? And the key is somehow. And then the question is, well, how? And when at least with respect to the Orthodox traditions, the Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox and Anglican traditions, so they don't have a sort of this way and not another way, right? Rather, they allow for various different ways in which theologians in this tradition have attempted to explain this, right? I think we should say something similar about the way we think about union with God. So in that sense, I agree that there's sort of the church has said, no, there isn't just one way to think about this. But so it is a kind of pluralism. The question is, what kind of pluralism is it? And I think another analogy that would be perhaps apt in both cases is to say that that they can't all be right.
Yeah, so that's
right.
Yeah, so this
they can't all be right, and so we should be arguing about them. It's just that the argument is an argument that takes place within the tradition, and which is an argument that doesn't define sort of who's a heretic or not, as much as it is in trying to determine what we ought to think about this in a way that matters, obviously, for spiritual life and so on.
Yeah, so that's the point that was motivating the question. Is your claim is for the mystical theologian, contemplative practice and union with God. Those aren't just like when I was growing up. I thought you ought to do theology prayerfully because you're more likely to get divine guidance that way, or things like that. But on this picture, it's you're getting experiences that have informational content. But then we look back and we see, well, there are now basically sort of different stories about what the mystical path is and what
Yeah.
what experiences we're looking to. You might even tell a story according to which you don't need these kind of super experiences that Teresa and John had. You just the ordinary experiences that you have just going to church and partaking in the sacraments. Maybe those have the content you need for theology. But now the worry is these different folks will get different contents. And so then the question is, well, is it that they're getting just kind of different perspectives on an underlying truth?
Yeah, right.
Or is it, no, one of them's right, the others are wrong,
Right.
and good luck sorting it out.
At most, one is right. Maybe they're all wrong. But I mean, I think that a couple of things to say about that. One is to say that it might be the case that one is right and others are wrong, but that doesn't necessitate that everyone else is completely wrong, right? That is to say that what the deliverances of the different models don't have to be necessarily mutually exclusive. We can't know until we look. In other words,
this also reminds me of. It always has seemed to me that sometimes there's value in having different models, especially when there's no way of actually, being sure which one, if any, capture the truth. And there's the distinction between wisdom, basically, and knowledge is often that, look, I've explored different models. I understand there are these different possibilities. Maybe there's no way to know if one of these models is, the right one. But there's value in being able to have these different models. That I develop the contours of the view. I receive wisdom that way. I understand the different possibilities, and so understand sort of what the epistemic space is. I feel like that's a perspective that's consistent with what Samir is outlining.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and I think that was something along those lines was going to be my second point, that there's a heuristic value to this that is independent of the correctness question. So on the one hand, we can we should be motivated internally in terms of in our tradition to argue about these things, because I'm suspicious about the claim that this can't matter so much, right? Because we disagree.
Yeah.
Right. Anyway.
So, suppose the mystical theologians are right, and that you need to have some kind of experience, some kind of whether it be mediated or direct, or who knows what kind, but some kind of experience of God to do theology properly. What about meta-theology?
Yeah.
Do you need? Is that a purely rational enterprise?
That's a good question. I don't know what to say about that. I mean, I suppose that metatheological reflection is dependent in one way on theological reflection. So if you think that the way in which we reflect theologically is dependent on having had certain experiences and so on, and you conduct yourself in your inquiry as if that were the case, right? Then when you step back to do metatheology, then it's dependent on those first order practices.
But the mystical theologian isn't just describing what they're doing. Here's how we do theology.
Right.
But, you others may do it
Right.
differently. It's a normative claim, right? If it's a normative claim, then you got to wonder, well, where do they get it? And I think that's an interesting question. If the claim is, well, this is a deliverance of pure reason, I'm not so sure. If the claim is, no, we get that the same way we got the theological claims. What are the norms for doing meta-theology, and where do those come from? You can kind of see regress beginning.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. I'm not sure what to say about that. Except to say, I don't know how relevant this is, that the norms for the practice are internal to the practice. In the same, one of the sort of guiding image for me in thinking about theology this way is to think about the case in morality and thinking about actually just moral or aesthetic, any kind of value inquiry. And so, think about the ability to reflect on the nature of, say, kindness or something like that, and the way in which it's dependent upon your sort of sensitivities. So think one way to bring this out is to contrast the case of the way the person's ordinarily constituted with respect to their moral sensibilities, and say the psychopath, the clinical psychopath, who's affectively debilitated in a certain kind of way. And it's an interesting, empirical question as to the extent to which a psychopath can reflect on cases of kindness, can make claims about kindness without parasitically depending upon somebody's experiences of kindness, right? Mm-hmm. And I want to say something similar is true for theology. And so it might be possible to see the parasitic relationship between the practice of theology and the experiences of God as being democratized across maybe not just one person, but several people. So in somebody in the community has to have certain kind of experiences of God, which are right. Mm-hmm. So I think that I'm attracted to that weaker claim, but it establishes what's important to me about the stronger claim.
Yeah.